you must have been hearing and reading about refugees in the news lately and wondered, what are these people like? So I stand before you as a child of refugee parents. And when my father was 12 years old, India became independent from the British. After 350 years, the British decided to leave. But as they left, they divided the country into two countries, Pakistan for Muslims and India. But nobody really knew what that meant. You know, imagine a morning in August of 1947, and the newspapers are full of news that we are independent. But what does it really mean? And now there's a border. Where are people supposed to go? And how are they supposed to get there? So my grandfather sold whatever he could sell, and they converted any money that they had into a form that they could carry easily with them, and my grandmother sewed that into her petticoats so that nobody would know she had money and nobody would rob them. And they left and walked and took buses in these convoys called kafilas that traveled 500 kilometers to where they imagined the border was, because this border wasn't marked. And when they got there, they were in a place where nobody spoke their language, nobody knew their traditions. They had to reinvent themselves. So they lived, you know, in religious halls and communal places for a few months till they found out what was going to happen to them. They were fed by charities, and then some official somewhere allocated them a house in a village. So home was a bureaucratic stroke of a pen. And so they moved there, and my father got an education, and he was interested in, you know, poetry and music and literature. He got a degree in chemistry because it was really practical and he could get a job. And he taught college and eventually joined the Indian Army. And being a person in the army meant he moved every 2 years. So there was no attachment to a place since he was 12 years old. And this effect lasts across generations. My siblings and I never lived more than 2 years in any one place. By the time I was 16, I had moved 6 towns. By the time I was 26, I had changed 3 countries. Right now, I've had 3 nationalities. I speak 7 languages. So who can tell me what home really means for refugees? Eventually, my parents, of course, here they are, they married. They had me, which was a very special moment. But what I want to say is not that we should pity these refugees, because I'm not looking at them as victims. I'm looking at them as people who are the first truly modern citizen subjects of the 20th century, right? Even though they lost everything they had, they wore their modernity like a second skin. They didn't have tradition, but they had innovation. They didn't have a past, but they had a future. And they worked, you know, and they built these, you know, nation states that arose in the middle of the 20th century. Think about countries like Turkey, like Israel, like Pakistan, like India, like Lebanon. They're all made with the work of refugees. Think about huge global cities like New York and London and Karachi and Delhi and Beirut and, you know, Istanbul. Where would they be without the energy of refugees? So they are the quintessential figures of the 20th century. When we look at the world around us and when we look back at the 20th century, and I'm old enough to look back at the 20th century and draw some lessons from it, we see that it's a century of massive displacement and people traveling all over because of various reasons, you know, partitions, wars, decolonization, ease of travel, cheap airfares, whatever, right? I mean, people travel all the time. But most of them don't have a choice. And The UN, I think, estimates something like 55 million people of concern, which includes refugees, stateless people, etc., and 62 million people who are actually displaced from their homes. Those are huge numbers. The world's population is only 7.4 billion. So a huge percentage of that is on the move, right? So what does this mean? It means that we have to revise our ideas of what is a nation state. You know, we assume that it's a God-given natural state, that countries are, you know, naturally coherent, and we know what it means to be American or Indian or, you know, whatever it is. But no, they're completely artificial. They're made up. Every time we go to vote, every time we go to a school, we join the army, we read a newspaper, we enter a different time zone, we are making up the nation state. We are creating it anew. It's called a daily plebiscite. Nation states' borders, they don't mean anything. They only mean what people make of them at any given time. And one of the results of this displacement that, you know, we've been experiencing, particularly over the last 20 years or so, is that the artificiality of this construct is becoming more and more apparent. When people can't keep people inside their borders or keep people outside their borders, when countries change, you know, that is when we know that these nation states are on the verge of breaking down. And that's terribly, terribly scary, right? In the US, we are protected from that because of our geography. But if you live in any landlocked or land-adjoining country, you know how scary this terrifies us. And so we come up with plans to put people in camps, plans to, you know, use barbed wire and electric fences to keep them out. And we never question ourselves and say, what makes up a country? Look at these two faces. They're both Indians. Can you tell me that India is an ethnically homogeneous country? And yet, there are people who insist that that's true. The EU wants to pay the Turkish president millions and millions of dollars to keep refugees inside Turkey and not let them get to Europe, because if they get to Europe, somehow that is going to threaten the European project. What does that mean, right? So I'm not saying here that, you know, we have to be scared of them, and nor am I going to go into detail about why we shouldn't be scared of them. I mean, there are two obvious reasons why we are scared of refugees. One is, you know, we fear that they're going to threaten our security, which is a thinly veiled form of Islamophobia. The other reason we think is that somehow they're going to disturb the homogeneity of our population, that, you know, they're going to inject diversity. But as I just said, you scratch a homogeneous country and you find diversity, right? These European countries that want to reject Syrians, they're full of the most diverse people. Slavs and, you know, Franks and Roma and these, so it doesn't even make sense. But what I do want to say to you is think about what refugees bring, right, to a country. What is it? What are the gifts that they bring? And that's why I called my talk Refugees with Benefits. First of all, when refugees come to these countries, they come as ready-made citizens. Most of them are working age, most of them have skills, most of them are educated. They're right there in countries that have demographic declines and falling fertility levels as ready-made workers. And you don't need to pay a lot to make sure that they have, you know, pensions and other forms of medical care. Get them working in the economy. Find a way to integrate them. One of the reasons my father was so successful when he came is because the Indian state offered him subsidized education and job training. That's what refugees need, an opportunity to get integrated into local economies, right? Secondly, it doesn't have to cost a lot. There was a survey done recently which said if Germany resettled all the refugees that have arrived at its borders, it would cost less than 1% of its GDP. That's a huge bonus. Thirdly, think of it as an opportunity. Don't think of it as a failure. Because nobody wants to leave their home and, you know, go somewhere else. But once they're there, it's a great opportunity. There's a scholar called Alexander Betts who has suggested setting up special economic zones in underdeveloped or undeveloped parts of the EU where refugees could actually produce and market goods and services, and they wouldn't have to be a drain on their welfare state. That's a great idea. We need more ideas like this. So what I'm saying to you is, yes, you can help refugees, but they don't want to be dependent on your aid. They want to be able to do something for you, right? So learn what they can do for you and make them do it. Think about all the great refugees in history. The guy who discovered the theory of relativity was a refugee. The father of psychoanalysis was a refugee. The guy who made all these iPods and iPads you carry around was the son of a refugee, right? So these are all people who are very energetic and very innovative, and they can be used in societies really fruitfully. The last thing I'll say is this. You remember the phrase, you can be anything you want to be? Perhaps your parents said it to you. Well, my parents said it to me, but they didn't say it as a promise or as a way to make me feel good. It was a threat. Right? Because to a people that have lost everything, the only thing you carry with you is what's in your hands, your skills, and what's in your head. It's your education and what you can do. And that's the only way you can be whatever you want to be. Thank you.